Hello, Honors 410. Hope everyone had a great weekend. To start off today's class, I just wanted to hit a handful of housekeeping notes to check in about where we are in the semester right now. So first off, just a reminder for folks in cluster number 3 for the flash fiction assignment that your assignments are due for next time. So please make sure you're getting those in no later than 11 a.m. Again, I always appreciate coming a little bit earlier. That lets me post the class a little bit earlier for everyone to get started. So far, I think they've been great. I really appreciate the effort students are putting in, both from the creative end of writing these things, as well as from the end of giving each other some positive feedback or asking some questions related to each other's pieces. At this stage especially, I'm not expecting sort of, polished, publishable quality, pieces, but rather, again, just a good faith effort that you're, doing your best to tell a story that has some dimension of violence associated with it. Again, pretty open-ended in terms of what that means, which I think the class has reflected really nicely so far. We've kind of run the gamut in different styles of piece and different concerns related to violence. So really looking forward to what the rest of you have coming for us. One note I wanted to add, this has not been a problem so far, so this is not correcting anyone, but it's more just something that I should have said earlier. In terms of the discussions we have going on, if you're the author, I encourage you to kind of lean back and not substantively weigh in on the discussion of your own piece until relatively late in the process. Give it at least a full day before you do so. If it's just a quick, thank you to someone who gave you a compliment, that's totally fine, right? Or if it's answering a quick logistical question, that's okay as well. The risk, and again, I have not seen it yet in this class, but it can come up, of having the writer too much in the conversation is it can kind of derail the discussion if the author is just kind of explaining their whole piece and sort of, talking about what they meant to do and so on and so forth in a way that's not necessarily helpful to other students being able to have their own interpretations of it and pull useful things from the text. So again, I've not seen that be a problem yet in this class, but especially in the online format, I think it kind of invites that sort of thing to happen. And so just kind of putting the word out there about that. But again, really looking forward to Flash Cluster number 3 coming up on Wednesday, and then just carrying forward with the rest of the schedule from there. Our first, I should say, group-led discussion will be coming up not this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday after that. So again, for that group, I expect they've probably got a start on this already at this point, at least in connecting with each other and maybe reading ahead a little bit. Just as a reminder or a clarification, make sure you're reading the assigned reading for that day. Basically, you're taking on my role for the day. So I will probably not post a video lecture, or maybe an abbreviated one if I do, on days when we have group-led discussions. The idea is that the group is kind of walking us through the text, and not necessarily comprehensively, but just generally giving us an idea of what's going on in the text, the elements they thought were especially interesting. And it could be pieces that they found interesting that do not directly come from the text, but rather outside research they chose to do. That is fair game for the assignment if you're so inclined to do that. Not required. But then also to give us at least 3 open-ended questions to help kind of steer the class in terms of what we'll do in the discussion thread, questions of interest to you. As always, you're welcome in the discussion thread to go other places in addition to what the group gives us, but I think that at least gives us some foundation to have a discussion, especially if anyone struggled with the text, right? Again, part of, I think, the value of video lectures as well as group-led video discussions is to just give kind of a gateway into the text and kind of places where it might be useful to pay attention and raise some questions. So I really look forward again to seeing what that group does as well. Especially because they'll be the first group to go. I welcome them to contact me if they want to talk a little bit about what they're planning or if they have questions. I tried to structure it so almost every group has at least 2 people in it who had a class with me before, usually Honors 110 or a different Honors 410 class, or in some cases both. But so who have done something like this before, have some idea of my expectations. Because I know if everyone is just kind of going into this blind, it can be especially intimidating as an assignment. But if you've, know in general kind of what I'm looking for, have seen these happen before, I think you'll agree it's a relatively straightforward thing. And so not something to be hugely stressed out about. But in any event, please do feel free to contact me with questions if you do have them. And then the last reminder I wanted to give before we get into today's reading is about the critical essay assignment. So I just want to keep this, in your in your sights, I guess is a way of saying it. So it is due 2 weeks from today. So you still have a fair bit of time, especially because it's a relatively short essay. But if you haven't started thinking about it yet, kind of getting your thesis statement together, that sort of thing, I'd say it's a good time to get to that, right? Because I think essays like this are not super challenging if you give yourself a solid week plus to work on them. It's when you let them wait until the very last minute, they can become kind of an overwhelming task, even for really strong writers. So again, just be mindful of kind of your own timeline on that, and don't let it sneak up on you there. Okay, all that said, let's get into The Longer We Were There by Stephen Moore. And we're starting relatively late in the book. This book is a collection of essays, right? And they're all to at least some degree related to his experience in the Iowa National Guard and going to Afghanistan. And you'll see what I mean. So I know some of you have already read the whole book from what you told me, so that's good on you to get ahead in that way. But for those who haven't, you'll see there are some that are kind of from before his experience or when he's back home. So they don't necessarily speak directly to his experience in Afghanistan, but they all are connected to at least some degree to that experience. And I would say that's sort of the central concern of this collection of essays. And, it's all nonfiction. So Stephen Moore is a real person. He had these experiences, but I would also term it creative nonfiction. So we can assume that he's taking some liberties with some of the scenes he constructs here. So the general story he's telling is true, but he wasn't necessarily carrying a notebook the whole time and catching down verbatim what everybody said, right? He's basing it on memory. We understand that everything, factually may not have happened exactly the way that it's laid out here. He has some artistic license to kind of craft it kind of for his purposes, but the general stories he's telling are true. And that's oversimplifying the ideas a little bit, but I think most of you can follow in general what I'm talking about there. So I have a bunch of places that I'd like to take us in the text. I might not go through my entire list because I realized after I was preparing for class today that I had a pretty long list, but I'll get through at least a fair number of them. But as always, feel free to bring in your own observations and places that were kind of interest to you. But I want to start on page 157, which is pretty early on. This is just a couple pages into this essay here. Where he talks about this sentiment. It seemed impossible to try to pull apart the being happy from how I arrived at it. So just to take a step back, kind of the whole premise of this essay, and again, I'm going to oversimplify and feel free to, kind of put in your own interpretations if you disagree with me with elements about this, but basically that he's going to this big welcome home ceremony for soldiers who've been abroad, and he's not entirely comfortable with it, right? So he's sort of grappling with some of these ideas around, he has survived this experience. I think it's somewhat fair to say there's some degree of survivor's guilt, but also just this kind of, completely alien experience to so many of us who have not had, military service or, not gone abroad during it. And rationalizing that with his civilian experience. And so, this quote about it seemed impossible to try to pull apart the being happy from how I arrived at it. Again, I'm kind of taking this a little bit out of context, but the idea that, you go to a ceremony to celebrate everything you've done, you might feel happy in that moment, but it's hard to separate that from the less happy elements of how you got there, right? So more directly applying it to Moore's experience, being in Afghanistan, enduring some of the hardships and dangers that he endured there, it's hard to just be happy now, right? Knowing what he went through to get there. On page 159, let's see if I can find the exact quote here. He's quoting Joan Didion. He refers to Didion a fair number of times throughout this thing. But yeah, okay, so this quote here, it's kind of, midway-ish down page 159. You probably can't see that very well at all, so I got a glare coming in from my window, but around this point in the page there, so Didion writes, the imposition of a sentimental or false narrative on the disparate and often random experience that constitutes the life of a city or a country means necessarily that much of what happens in that city or country will be rendered merely illustrative, a series of set pieces or performance opportunities. So this idea here that when we look back on a place or an experience, that really we're not looking back at the thing itself, but rather, kind of things that were cherry-picked to represent what it was like. And imposing meaning on it by extension from that, right? So this idea that, we choose this one particular moment to exemplify, well, this is what San Francisco is. This is what New York is. This is what Las Vegas is. All right. But that's consciously chosen and kind of curated by whoever is telling the history, and then they're imposing whatever meaning they want on that, right? Because they chose it for a reason to illustrate something, and it's up to kind of the author to craft that and the reader to kind of receive it in that way. So, and I mean, it's kind of an interesting moment there, and if people have kind of responses to that, I think that could be an interesting moment for us to discuss a little bit. Jumping ahead here to page 165, there's this whole discussion of the Golden Gate Bridge, right? So we have more showing this picture of it to these other people who've never been close to this location. I showed him the Golden Gate Bridge, which he'd never heard of. I explained that it was called the Golden Gate Bridge because though it actually looked red, though the name of the red paint was called Millennium Orange. Shabir translated everything about the different colors. And I just think this is an interesting kind of fun moment in the essay, and I think this is something that Moore sort of does a lot throughout the essay. I think you'll encounter this a number of times through the reading assignments I've given you for the next couple weeks. But this idea that words can be such arbitrary things, and especially trying to interpret the English language and American customs and traditions and concepts that are so intuitive to us can nonetheless be really confusing once we kind of isolate them and kind of try to look at them more objectively. So here he's got, again, the thing called the Golden Gate Bridge. I imagine pretty much everyone in class has some concept of what that looks like, a picture in your head. But it's called golden, but it actually looks red, but the color of paint is actually called Millennium Orange. When you stop and think about that, that's kind of nuts, right? Like, who could follow that logic? Even though all of us have a picture in our head, even though I think most of us take it for granted that that's what this thing is called, nonetheless, it's sort of inherently confusing. I think that's something that Moore does a compelling job of kind of unpacking for us there and showing sort of the absurdity of. I think we can apply that absurdity to other situations as well, right? He's focusing on language here and on a specific landmark, but I think you could apply that to his experiences as a soldier, his experiences in the military, so on and so forth. So that's more something to kind of keep in your rear view mirror there, just to reflect on. I think we might come back to that concept as we go through this book. Next place I wanted to go was page 173, and the end of the second paragraph here. So this journalist comes to him, and I think that this is always the moment in this essay that this whole exchange kind of sticks with me the most. The journalist asks, "Are you happy to be home?" And she wasn't asking me per se. She was asking a soldier. The ceremony was for families and the article for the public. Sentimentality was the whole point, a kind of first act. I just kind of love and I'm so kind of drawn to this moment here in this discussion. When she's asking him this question, so this is a journalist who's come to the ceremony, is asking Moore, you have to be home after having been in Afghanistan, and he's trying to parse all this and make sense of it. And he's like, she's not really asking Stephen Moore as a person here. She's just asking some generic soldier, right? Because she wants some sort of generic answer to follow about, yes, I'm so happy, I miss my family, I love my country, yada, yada, yada. And not to say those are bad sentiments to have or false ones to have, but just that she's not looking necessarily for a nuanced answer, right? That is very specific to Moore's experience. So much she just wants a quote from a soldier that she can throw into this article. The idea this article is for public consumption, right? So this article is not for Moore. It's not to document his experience so he can look back on it. It's for the public so they have something to reflect on coming out of this ceremony that's happened. So I don't know. I think that's a really interesting moment there. And then we get the mom's answer here, right? Where she says, take all the good words and then put them together, because that's what this day is. And that's on page 174 in the second paragraph there. And I'm just going to leave the mom's quote there because Moore ultimately seems to like it, right? He kind of says, yeah, that was the right answer, even though it might not literally be the true answer. But I think that in and of itself is a really interesting moment here. But I'm going to leave it in terms of your own interpretation of what do you think of the mom's answer? Why does she give that answer? Why does Moore kind of ultimately accept that as being a good answer? Do you think it's a good answer? Do you think it's an accurate answer or an appropriate answer to the situation? And how might those things all be different that I'm laying out there? Okay, and then I want to go ahead to page 176 here. Let's Let's see here. So this is the second full paragraph here. I pulled into the parking lot. The building was huge. I had drilled there a couple of times since being home, but I never noticed the sign out front. It didn't say armory like the old one did. It said Readiness Center. Apparently the armory was not an armory at all, as those soldiers no longer armed themselves, merely readied themselves, which meant they trained, which meant they effing armed themselves, and learned to commit acts of extreme violence as strangers drove past on the highway, which seemed to me like a long goddamn way from readiness. But F it, whatever, I was done. And I like this moment here in part just because, in my estimation, you may not 100% agree with me, but so be it. I think Moore is an incredibly eloquent writer. I think his prose style, he's very precise. He can be almost lyrical at points where he's kind of making a point quite beautifully in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of it if I'd had the same experience. But this moment here where he's got the expletives, where he ends it on, whatever, I was done. Right? That sounds a lot more conversational to me, a lot more casual in a way. And I'll kind of say it. I think we sort of see Moore as disillusioned, as exhausted. As he says, he's over it at that point, right? But I'm curious about reactions to that. If we kind of understand that, if we get where Moore's coming from, if we can relate to that. And overall, kind of what our reactions are there. So I'm going to leave there. I had a few other places earmarked, but I don't want to leave an overwhelmingly long lecture here, and I want to leave plenty of room for you to find your own points of interest as well and to raise questions. Some of this text I know can be a little bit dense, but I think that Moore does a compelling job, again, of bringing some concrete images in and bringing in these moments of, I would call them humor, and I think that it's debatable, but at least cynicism, and I would borderline, again, kind of call them comedic almost, that I think sort of bring us back in and kind of make the piece relatable in interesting ways. So I'm going to leave the discussion there. So again, please feel free to weigh in the general class discussion here below about any questions you might have about all the assignments and dates coming up that I had mentioned. But we'll focus most of today's discussion though on the Moore piece. And again, I've raised a bunch of questions and brought up different passages that were kind of interest to me. Feel free to comment on any of those, but also feel free to take it in your own direction of other things that stood out to you or questions you had. But thanks as always for watching, and I'll catch you all again on Wednesday.